Thanks you all for coming. My name is Michael McFall. I'm the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute. It's a real delight that we are co-hosting this event with the Atlantic Council today. President Ilves has spoken here before. I've had the pleasure of introducing him before, but he always comes with a new topic because he's always thinking about new things, especially the intersection of technology, governance, of which we're going to talk about today. We're doing this together with the Atlantic Council. Is that why we have the Twitter feed going? Is that an Atlantic Council thing? We don't do that at FSI. So Peter, I'm very impressed. We will copy that for the future. Peter Schechter is the director of the Latin American Center at the Atlantic Council, and he will shortly introduce the president to you. After the president's remarks, our own Frank Fukuyama, our new Director of Democracy Development and the Rule of Law, the Center on the Democracy Development and Rule of Law, which I used to run many years ago, will moderate the discussion after the President's remarks. So without further ado, Peter.
I'm Peter Schechter, and I'm the Director of the Latin American Center at the Atlantic Council. And let me just kick it off by first saying a few words of thanks. And the first word of thanks is obviously to our hosts here at Stanford. You know, they're co-hosting this event with us because we're kicking off a series called Democracy Rebooted, which considers the role of technology in elections. So thank you, Ambassador McFall, and thank you, Dr. Fukuyama, for moderating today, and to the whole team at the Center for Democracy Development and the Rule of Law for your work in putting this event together. I also want to give a word of thanks to Smartmatic. Smartmatic is sponsoring this series, and we're very fortunate to have Smartmatic's CEO here with us today, Antonio Mujica. And of course, a special thanks to President Ilves, because I traveled from Washington this morning, but President Ilves came from much further away. Before I introduce the President, I'd like to just give you a quick word of background on what this series and what this project is about. So I don't need to tell you in California about how technology is becoming more and more dominant in our lives. It's changed the way we call a cab, the way we book hotels, the way we manage our bank accounts. And so it seems to us at the Atlantic Council that technology will inevitably play a much larger role in elections. This Atlantic Council project, which encompasses my center, the Strategic Foresight Initiative of the Atlantic Council, and the South Asia Center, basically asks to consider the most responsible implementation of that technology. How can technology how can technology ensure more transparent, more accessible, and legitimate elections? In some places, technology is doing just that. In Brazil and in India, huge countries, both run their elections entirely electronically. And of course, Estonia is the poster child for e-governance, including voting online. But in other countries, like the Netherlands, like Ireland, and of course here in the United States, electronic voting has not been as successful. Indeed, the state of Maryland returns to paper ballots in 2016. So we're interested in the conditions that make technology a better tool to support a more robust technology. But we're also interested to learn why people are widely comfortable with using their phones for so many functions, yet voting still happens too often with pen and paper. I regularly allow my 2 teenage girls to take out their phone, push an app, they get picked up by a car with somebody that I don't know, and yet I trust that because the app says it's okay. But so many polling booths still use Scantrons. So the question is there something fundamentally different about using technology as a consumer versus using technology as a citizen? Is there a difference? So these are some of the questions that our project seeks to answer and to grapple with. And we're hugely fortunate to have one of the leaders in this field with us today. Estonia is a pioneer in electronic voting and e-governance, and President Ilves has played a crucial role in that. He served as president of Estonia since 2006, but since being a head of state didn't keep him busy enough. He's also played an active role in promoting e-governance throughout Europe, as well as serving as chairman of the EU Task Force on e-health and the chairman of the European Cloud Partnership Steering Board. Prior to the presidency, President Ilves served in the Estonian Parliament and as ambassador to the United States and Canada, where he spearheaded the Tiger Leap initiative to computerize and connect all Estonian schools online. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that President Ilves learned to program at age 13, something I imagine he has in common with some of you. I look forward to his remarks and to the conversation with Dr. Fukuyama. And with that, please join me in welcoming President Ilves here to Stanford.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words. I'll try to speak briefly because I think it's far more interesting to have a discussion with Francis Fukuyama than to hear me drone on. I will talk about later, I guess, when we discuss this together, about e-voting and what I think of it, because I think that it is a good idea, but it may not necessarily work in a lot of countries unless there's some prerequisites that are done, that we have done, and I'll say basically Estonia arrived at doing electronic voting. It was not a goal in itself, it was an afterthought with a system that we had that we realized we could do much more than we originally thought. Let me just explain how it is that we got to where we are. Estonia is a very small country. It was occupied by the Soviet Union, then the Nazis, then the Soviet Union from 1940 to 1991, and then it became independent again in 1991. And we found that our dearest and closest neighbors who speak a mutually unintelligible language, the Finns, who had been at a same level of development in 1940 as we were, there was a 13-fold difference in GDP per capita between us and the Finns. So we were very poor, they were doing rather well, and so when we were sitting there going, now we're independent, now what? At least what I thought about at the time was that, well, there are certain areas where we are still on a level playing field, that while we, in terms of infrastructure development, all kinds of things, had lost 50 years, at least when it came to IT, we're all starting on a level playing field. Recall we became independent in 91. June 93 was the time when the first web browser came out, Mosaic, from Andreessen at Champaign-Urbana at the time. And so it was like everyone was there at the same place. So I thought, well, this is one way to go. And that was one reason why we had this idea of computerizing all of the schools, getting them online, and by 1997 all schools were online. A couple of other things that at least influenced my own thinking was reading a neo-Luddite book called The End of Work by Jeremy Rifkin, arguing that computerization was really bad, and one example he brought there was of a Kentucky steel plant that was bought by Japan and earlier had 12,000 employees and produced X million tons of steel, and after it was automatized and computerized, 120 employees produced the same X amount of steel. Now, while this was an example for him of how bad all this was, if you're a country of 1.3 or 4 million people, you go, wow, that's great. We can do all kinds of things and basically liberate people from doing things the machines could do better. And so the general direction was to try to incorporate as much technology as we could into the way we ran our government. What we did, or sort of thinking about this, and with a lot of very creative young people involved, realized really the core issue for anything in terms of e-governance is the idea of identity. You need to have a secure identity. If you do not have a secure identity, then, well, if you recall, there was once a New Yorker cartoon where one dog is in front of a computer and looks at the other dog and says, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. Well, this is the crucial problem of virtually all hacks that we have seen, is that you don't know whether it's a dog or whoever it is that's coming in. So what we basically we came to conclude was that if you want a secure identity, you need a two-factor identification or validation system, so one of which has to be on a chip. So initially it would have a chip within a card, and now then a couple of years later we decided, well, you already have a chip in your mobile phone. Your SIM card is a chip, so that we can also use that, but you need two factors. If you don't have that, forget it. And this is, I think, the problem with, all these awful events. I mean, most recently, the Office of Personnel Management losing all records of, or having stolen all records of all federal employees in the United States. You don't want those kinds of things happening. So, but in any case, we adopted this system, and then that would have an identity, and then the other part that we had that is crucial to all of this is the architecture of the back end. That is to say, how you connect everything up. So that if you get in somewhere, should happen to get in through the sneaky system, that you don't get very far. I'm really grossly simplifying here, but in any case, the point is that it's in the architecture, it's in the identification that allows you to do anything at all. And the kinds of things that we have done, for example, we have an electronic signature law, and you can sign documents, full force of contract law, that you do digitally. We do all of our taxes online. It's not simply that you fill something out, but rather when it's time to do your income taxes, because companies do submit their payroll in real time constantly. When it comes to do your taxes, you see how much money you've made, all of your tax deductible contributions. They've all been filled in there. So basically, you end up with your tax record in front of you, and you then look it over, and if it looks more or less okay, you press the enter button, and within 24 hours you get your refund, if you get a refund. And so thinking of these different kinds of services, let's see, one other which we especially like and is very popular, used by the entire population, is we have electronic prescriptions, which is that if you go to a doctor, the doctor will type in the prescription to the computer, and then you go with your card to any pharmacy, stick it in, put in your number, and then you get your medicine. I remember reading that 5,000 people die a year in the United States from badly written prescriptions because the pharmacist reads it wrong. Well, we hope that the doctor doesn't make a typo, but in any case, those kinds of systems work superbly well. Now, if you already have a system like that in which you have developed a huge amount of trust in the government and public sector and private sector system that includes the validation, authentication of signatures and so forth, then one service you can provide is voting. And this is something we have done. Now, a number of countries actually are going away from this idea because they do not have the infrastructure. For us, voting is an ancillary thing that comes along with everything else that everyone does anyway, and there is trust in the system. But in order to have a genuinely secure system, the investment to be made just for voting is so huge that if you want a really secure system, that no one really wants to do it. The reason why no one wants to do it is because no one really wants to have a system, or a few countries who are willing to have a system in which you have a strong electronic identity. It's curious, I find, that the 5 countries most opposed to having an electronic identity are the UK, the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, which if you know what the 5 I's are, the 5 countries that cooperate with NSA, GCHQ in the UK, the 5 countries that are actually sharing electronic information are the countries that don't, where the people don't want to have electronic IDs. But for us, we have a degree of social trust in the system. Our medical records are there, our pharmaceutical records are there. We believe in the system working. So far it has worked. and with some 240 million legal acts done via this system, that is bank transactions, contracts, all kinds of other things, then voting has not been something that has aroused a lot of worry in the country because people's money is still intact, their health records haven't been changed, and so on. So that gives a far greater degree of trust to it. We have had 8 elections over 10 years that have been done electronically. The first couple of times we got 5% of the population. The last 3 elections, about a third of people vote online. We have done studies on this. Initially, there were differences between, sort of age differences between paper voting and electronic voting, and income differences, levels of education. The last 3 elections, in a study done by the European University in Florence, which actually then did a big poll, found that in fact differences have been eliminated. There's no more, it's not as if old people, you do it less than young people, or the left does it more, left-wing people being more progressive are more likely to vote than right-wing people. So no age differences, no real political differences, no difference in level of education or rural versus urban. Of course, some of that comes from the fact that we are all online in my country, so it doesn't really matter. You're just as well connected if you're in the countryside as if you're in the city. But the point is it's our solution. It works for us. What it does do, it increases enfranchisement in the part of people, say, living abroad, because as a small country, I mean, we have a general consulate in New York, we have an embassy in Washington, but if you're living in California, you're not going to be able to vote in elections there's no diplomatic representation here. On the other hand, one of the former CEO of Skype, which is an Estonian company, by the way, or was until Microsoft bought it, he was here at Stanford, in fact, and he voted. He said he was visited by a friend from Finland who couldn't vote because because the closest general consulate is in LA, and he wasn't going to drive down there to vote. But if you're Estonian, you can vote. So that's one of the advantages of doing this system. I don't know, I guess in the Q&A we can talk about all kinds of things. But what we do is a solution to our particular problem, which is how does a modern small society exist and come out of poverty. And right now, I guess in January, there will be the World Bank will finally, after 70 years, will be producing its first IT and development report. I'm one of the co-chairs of that group coming out with this, but looks very carefully at how, in fact, you can use IT for countries to develop. Clearly, the greatest advantage is transparency in society. We are a very, very transparent country. Every day, if I want to, I can go and look at who has been rummaging around in my financial data, because they're always doing that. But it does lead to a dramatic decrease in corruption. So, by far the least corrupt post-communist country is Estonia, and kind of an interesting sideline is that of the old European countries that have had financial difficulties in the last several years, all of them do worse than we do on corruption. We're basically at the same level of corruption as the United States. Now, is that good or bad? I leave that up to you, but in Transparency International, US is 24 out of 200, we're 28 out of 200. So that's more or less where we are. Other things that we do because of the system that we have is that we have a once-only law, which means that the government may never ask you anything it already has. Citizens own their own data, which means that all your medical records or any other records are yours, and people may not look at them without your permission unless they are authorized, such as your personal doctor whom you have authorized can look at them, and obviously the tax people can look at your tax records. And so forth, but in general, you own your own data, and therefore it's a new concept that we hope will spread through Europe and perhaps even other countries. With that, I mean, I'm sort of a shotgun approach to things because I don't know what people are that interested in, but I'll end with that and speak with one of my favorite writers of all time.
Well, President Ilves, welcome to Silicon Valley, welcome to Stanford, and welcome to CDDRL. It's a really great pleasure. This is our first event of the academic year, so it's great to have you with us. I visited Tallinn, I think, in the early 2000s, and I was taken to the cabinet room. And it was very impressive because every minister had a monitor and they were all connected, and it was something that I doubt you could have seen in Washington, D.C. At that point. I don't know whether you can do it now in the cabinet. Is that, Mike, do they have such a system? No comment, okay. It's quite interesting to hear you describe the kinds of services that you can get in Estonia using this kind of system. So I want to get to electronic voting, but before that, I want to ask, the most obvious use of this electronic technology in government that everybody immediately thinks about is as a means of facilitating greater participation. So you have this idea that citizens, instead of voting every 2 years or 4 years for a representative, will have a little clicker and they can say, well, what do you think we should do for healthcare reform? And they'll say, yes or no, and this sort of thing. But that's obviously problematic. I think that, for example, when the FCC put up their new rules for net neutrality, and made it open to comment, if you counted all the social media comments, they got like 12 million of them or so. And so it's very hard to know in a democracy how you deal with the possibility. Obviously you get more opportunities for participation, but is that actually something that we could make use of to actually make government better?
I fear not, in that, you have in a representative democracy, you have someone who is elected there from your district who is representing you, and you know how they vote. When you look at the nitty-gritty of a law, as in it was Bismarck who said, two things you shouldn't see, how you make sausage and how you make laws. But when you have that law there, and you're going to vote on the subsection, yes or no, you're going to have a few people actually going online? Will they determine this? And you don't know who it is because it's not. The representative, the person you have elected from your district, that he or she is responsible for the vote on this one little thing. Now, but I really can't imagine too many people other than the particular vested interest in that law. Say it's a drug company, probably really cares about how you're going to make a certain paragraph in a law, and will probably get some people to vote online. But but it's otherwise, 99.9% of the citizenry will not care at all about some subsection on sort of VAT for a certain drug or something, or sales tax, whatever it is. And so, in fact, you are not doing a service to representative government, and there's no real accountability for that there. And so I think it's a nice idea, and we have plenty of people in my country also saying, well, we should do it with the parliament, we just vote all of us online, but without citizen participation in the way that, you really have a large percentage of people participating, it's already getting problematic, and you have no real accountability, which is really the hallmark of a representative democracy. Mm.
Well, I've got a related question about transparency. So you, I think, rightly said that Estonia has been moving up in the Transparency International rankings because you're such a transparent country. But it does seem to me that there may be some actual limits to how useful transparency could be. There was a book by a guy named Dave Eggers called The Circle, right, which was about a fictional Google-like company. But at one point in the novel, a politician gets this idea that they're going to wear a camera that 24/7 will broadcast everything they say and do, no privacy whatsoever. And this takes off because all the other politicians say, oh, I don't have anything to hide. And so everybody's wearing a camera like this. And among the consequences is everybody stops deliberating because, you know, frankly, if you're going to negotiate about something, you don't want this under the full glare of, you know, the entire country watching. So I wonder, you know, what your attitude towards this is. I mean, I know there are vast areas in Europe and in the United States where there's obviously insufficient transparency, but does it get problematic at a certain point?
Well, I think Google Glass already sort of ran into that problem because you might, I mean, you're going to be, and if you look at it in any direction, there's someone there, they're somehow being downloaded or uploaded. And that, I think, is objectionable to people, and I think that is, I mean, now, if Google Glass were to have taken off, I bet we would have had all kinds of incidents of people getting punched in the face in the bus or something. Now, the transparency versus privacy thing is a tough one, and I'll bring one example of it, and some of it's very cultural. In Northern Europe, countries like mine and Finland and Sweden, Denmark, the UK, have a general principle that all public money must be known, how it's spent. If it's public monies, you know, taxes or whatever, tariffs, where it goes has to be known, and we follow that principle. Now, in the European Union, of which we're a member, there's basically a $1 trillion budget over a 7-year period. 40% of that goes to agriculture. And until about 7 years ago, it was all secret, who got what. We only knew that, you know, France got 10%, Estonia got 0.3% or whatever the percentage is, but who got what was not known. A group of countries from Northern Europe in the Commission pushed through a new regulation that said, following this principle, all public data, public monies must be known publicly, and so for 2 years it was known that, in fact, who got what money, and it turned out that instead of the usual rhetoric that the common agricultural policy monies were all for, you know, small farmers protecting their rural way of life in some obscure valley in some obscure place, and that they've always been doing this. It turns out the big agribusiness companies were raking in billions. So forget that myth. But what happened then was that a group of countries, I think it was France, Germany, and Italy, took the European Commission to court, and the European Higher Court of Justice, where our Supreme Court in Europe decided, yes, this is a violation of privacy. We were certainly, what do you mean? This is not private, this is public money. But there are cultural attitudes that in Southern Europe, it's who gets what public monies is not an issue of, they see it as an issue of privacy. Who's right? I mean, we're talking about countries that are all Western liberal democracies. But there are different attitudes even within something as generally similar as, you know, parliamentary democracies in Europe. So what is the answer? I don't know. I mean, the court decided that that was too much. We didn't like that, and then the result is that what the court decides is that countries can do this themselves. So you'll note that Estonia and the UK and Sweden will announce who gets what money, who got how much money in agricultural supports from the European Union, but other countries you won't see a word on that or a number.
Do your ministers have trouble deliberating because everything is under such scrutiny, or is that not a problem?
No, I mean, they have discussions without anyone being there. That's what governments do to reach conclusions. But so we don't have cameras looking at, having, you know, cabinet meetings. But on the other hand, everything that is spent is public. You know, so yeah, I think that the issue of privacy since the Snowden revelations, of course, has sort of really risen to the fore. privacy is, I mean, I think we need to do a lot of work on privacy. Privacy as a notion exists actually in Western liberal democracy only since about 1894 with a landmark ruling by here in the United States. We're saying that, you know, unreasonable search and seizure extends to pictures. That was a Louis Brandeis ruling, and it's sort of classical and something that, I mean, in Europe, it's also known. That's the beginning of privacy as a legal concept. That's 100 years old. I think one of the things that we have to really decide upon and will be facing now is that our notions of liberal democracy, the inherent rights of man, all the things that were part of the Scottish Enlightenment and then that Thomas Jefferson interpreted here in the late 18th century, which then went through a tremendous revolution in the changes of society in the 19th century with urbanization, industrialization, which you've written extensively on in your latest book, and then, that's a little plug. And
Thank you. Thank you.
and then, okay, but now we're facing something new, which is that, I mean, we are now in the 21st century, and I think we're going to have to go through yet another sort of deep think about what is a liberal democracy in the 21st century when technology can do things that no one could have ever imagined either in the days of Thomas Jefferson or in the days of Louis Brandeis.
Yeah. Well, I think the principle that certainly public finances ought to be completely transparent and open, but as you recall, the Polish government this past year was thrown into incredible turmoil because someone secretly recorded what they thought was a private conversation in a restaurant between some ministers where a lot of profanity and other things were revealed, and it was put on the internet. And there, it seems to me, it's not clear what the guiding principle ought to be in something like that, because even politicians, I would think, have a certain zone of privacy where not everybody ought to have a window in.
Well, I mean, if you're starting with the proposition that any mobile phone is a microphone, then you have to understand that is the case, and mobile phones are hackable, and it doesn't really take much. I mean, you can buy things to hack mobile phones or listen in on mobile phones for fairly cheap. So that's one reason why whenever you have a sensitive conversation in any country, you leave your mobile phones at the door. So on the other hand, I mean, often we forget, even when it comes to our mobile phones, I mean, what you do with most of your apps are you are putting in data. Those things they're not good Samaritans inventing apps for you that you've especially downloaded for free. Someone is monetizing those data. If you, I mean, that's why I say there's no such thing as a free app. Because if you put in, as I do, how many push-ups I did or something, I mean, someone is selling that data. You're voluntarily giving it up. It's actually, if you were to read the 200-page long agreement that you've signed with a click of a button for downloading the app, I mean, you have just given away your privacy, and who knows what else you've given away that's in your phone. So it's not just the evil NSA that's listening in on you. You yourself are participating in this process, and you've actually legally signed away your own rights.
Yeah, well, we Americans, for some reason, get really upset when the government violates our privacy, but we don't care when all these companies do exactly the same thing. Whereas in Europe, I think it's a little bit different. So, given stuff that's happened this week, I have to ask you. Getting to the question of electronic voting. So, as I think everybody is aware, there's been this enormous scandal now with Volkswagen, where it turns out that their software in their diesel cars had been trying to basically fool the emissions tests, and now that it's not clear whether this is just in the United States or whether this was happening in Europe too. And there's actually a very, I thought, good op-ed piece in today's New York Times in which someone was saying that the Internet of Things has got this really big problem because when these issues are embedded in software, it is almost impossible for outsiders to monitor that. So Peter was asking, why do people get more upset about electronic voting than other, using it for banking and things like that? And I think this gets to the issue that if you've got paper ballots and you think that someone's trying to steal the election, you can always go back and recount those ballots. Essentially, if you've got an electronic voting system, you have to trust the provider of the software that runs that system, that they're not trying to manipulate it, or even if they're not deliberately manipulating it, that they've got security systems that are good enough that they've prevented someone from getting into their software and doing something untoward. But since all the software is proprietary, it basically has to be done on trust. And you said, Estonia, you've come to trust these systems. I wrote a whole book on trust 20 years ago, and so it's a subject I've thought a lot about. But it does seem to me that you can trust your banking system, but you might actually have good reasons to not necessarily trust, a company that is in a position to throw an election or to, make some other really big, political interventions, and nobody knows about it.
Well, first of all, it's non-proprietary open source software, so there's no company. Well, what it comes down to is that it is such a small part of what you do otherwise with this system, with things that are very sensitive anyway, from healthcare records to financial data. It's so that it doesn't, I think the difference is with when you have, you don't ever use this, you don't ever use electronic, you don't use this system for anything else but for voting, so then you're dubious about it. But since all the time I'm going around doing something with the system that I have, I promulgate all my laws, by the way, online with a digital signature. I'm constantly using this, so I don't have a reason to doubt, and we do have a record of your vote. That remains there, and you can check yourself, did my vote for this candidate, is that registered? Yes, it's registered. And the other thing, it's not, as I said, we have basically 1/3 of the population does it, 2/3 doesn't. We've leveled off at 30%. And the key thing to all of these services, not only voting, but also all of the other stuff, be it a pharmacy or your medical records, it's a choice. You can always go the paper route if you want. It's not as if you're leaving that aside. I think that, I think we will always have to maintain the paper legacy options for citizens, because that's the way it is. It's just we see people more and more choosing to do things differently. As long as, so far, as long as you don't have a breakdown in things that you would think there's far greater incentive to go after, such as stealing people's money. I think there's far less interest in actually throwing a vote than there is in actually stealing you blind.
Well, we did have Florida in 2000.
Well, that was not electronic voting. That was those were hanging paper chads. Using really legacy technology.
Yeah.
The voting machine that sort of pokes a hole into something that must be 70 years old. So that's,
Right. I'm not going to make a case that we had a good system in Florida back then. So another issue of trust is really about, the security. You said in Estonia everybody owns their own data, but we've had these massive breaches of personal data, OPM, most recently, and obviously Target and all these other companies that thought that they were secure. I know there's a certain rather large country bordering Estonia that, has certain malevolent intentions, and there have been, efforts to,
Finland.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering, how big a threat in general do you think this is, and how do you think this race, I mean, we are in an arms race, basically, in cyber. How do you think this is going to play out? How big a threat really do you think this is?
Let me start from the beginning. I would say, first of all, the break-ins, I mean, the OPM thing is probably the worst, but I mean, that really comes from using insufficient security systems that a system that just has an email and a password does not work. I mean, I do trust it enough that I will order books from Amazon, and all they have there is a funny little 3-digit number on the back of the credit card, which is your security code, which is utterly ridiculous. But the point is that if you're going to have any kind of sensitive data, you can't just have an email and a password that you log into, because you don't know who it's doing the logging in. With our system or something like that, which is a 2-factor system, one of which must be a chip, you reduce the chances for actually illegal entry dramatically. And you do know then who it is that came in, and that what the route was. So that eliminates a lot of the problem, and I would say that any company or a government that does not use a two-factor ID for getting into anything sensitive is highly irresponsible. And I think the way that will be changed in the future is that insurance companies will say that we will not, that banks that write off stolen money to hacking will not be able to write it off as a business expense. The IRS will not allow them to write it off. I mean, as it is right now, a hacked, say, power station can say it's an act of God, but this by definition, a priori, is not an act of God. It is an act of man that someone has hacked into a power system. So I think that we need to really tighten up our understanding about security, but that again that people will have to understand that you need a personal identity to do that. I would say that all internal government communication should be done through a 2-factor system to prevent the kind of things that we've seen. Now, once we go beyond that, then I would say frankly, today you can shut down a country electronically. And the amount of nastiness that can occur is, the sky's the limit. And in unconventional ways. A couple of years ago, I remember reading these people in Los Angeles who were working on the traffic light system went on strike, and then they turned all the lights red. And they went to jail for that eventually. But I was thinking, well, imagine if they turned all the lights green. And you do that. New York City, Los Angeles,
yeah.
They'd be just paralyzed. And that's fairly low level compared to taking out the power system or something like that. So we really have to focus much more on the security systems that are in our critical infrastructure. And that's something that we need to raise awareness of, because we know if you can hack into personnel records, you can probably hack into a power station as well, unless you have the right security precautions taken. Now, where I think the beginning of that, where I'm worried, which I think I referenced before, but we've been focusing really on confidentiality. When we say, okay, Snowden this, and we're not, in confidentiality is the problem, and everyone is concerned about the government snooping. I personally, and especially with this thing called IoT, or the Internet of Things, I'm much more concerned these days about another aspect of security in computers and IT, which is the integrity of data. Integrity is whether or not someone's changing your data. And the difference, again, is between someone knowing my blood type or someone changing my blood type. So if my records are electronic and it says I'm Rh positive, all right, maybe I might not like to see it published in the sort of the evening news. On the other hand, it better be right, I mean, rather than have my my data be changed by someone, and that's where we have to get, where we have to be really worried when we get to the Internet of Things, because I mean, we think about malware as something doing nasty in a computer. Stuxnet the computers worked fine. What Stuxnet did was it changed the data going into the computer, and the computer worked exactly how it should based on the data it was fed, but the problem was the data it was fed, the data were wrong, and so the computer just started sending signals out to the centrifuges saying, you know, speed up, slow down, whatever it had to do. Now, if we get into IoT, when everything, your refrigerator, your house heating, your whatever, is all running through the internet, connected to each other, and then you start sending the wrong signals. This is where we have to be very careful and have to pay much more attention to the issue of integrity of data.
Yeah. So President Xi is going to follow the Pope visiting Washington, and one of the issues obviously is the cyber, domain, and right now it's the Wild West. I mean, there are no rules, international rules whatsoever. And can you imagine, I mean, first of all, is it just way premature to even talk about international rules in this domain? And if not, how do you begin that conversation?
Well, we do have some rules already, and there was something called the Budapest Convention. It was originally the Council of Europe Convention on Cybercrime. It came out of the Council of Europe, and then it was adhered to by the United States, by Canada, Japan, liberal democracies that would then, countries agree that they would, I mean, in the case of cybercrime, would then extradite people and would assist in investigations. The problem is that, well, Russia has not acceded to it. China has not acceded to it. And if you look at the source of much of hacking, it sort of ends up going in the direction of those countries. So you would say that liberal democracies have taken a step forward and do cooperate on these kinds of things. But get everyone on board is more difficult. So I say we've taken some steps forward, and I think liberal democracies generally do understand that this is I mean, if you're going to be a rule of law based state, you're going to have to adhere to certain rules and follow them and cooperate with other countries, because I mean, cyber is almost by definition cross-border. You'd be kind of dumb to do cybercrime in your own country, right? Because it's, I mean it gets done, but they also aren't very smart people, because I mean, then there are very clear laws. Whereas if you do things cross-border, then you might be able to get away with it. The U.S. has been quite aggressive, actually, in getting people who have committed crimes extradited, and has been quite successful at it. So I think we're taking steps in that direction. But in terms of getting everyone on board, I think it'll be a while.
Yeah. So I want to open up the discussion to the audience, but I can't resist one last question. So, so you mentioned countries that don't play by the rules, and you mentioned the country Russia, and that's obviously an issue that's of great concern to the Baltics and to your country. And I just wanted to know if you could give a general assessment, because I suspect you're going to be asked that anyhow. How worried are you, and where do you think post-Crimea that situation is going?
Well, what we've seen is that with the annexation, or the Anschluss of Crimea, we've violated basically all the fundamental principles of international law that really kept us going through the Cold War. I mean, we had the prohibition of aggression and the UN Charter. We had the basis of security in Europe, the 1975 Helsinki Final Act, forbidding changing borders through aggression. We have the Paris Charter of 1990, which again also in addition to reiterating that, provides for the right of every signatory to choose its own security arrangements and alliances. Now, if you see Russia using as justification for both invading Georgia and also for Ukraine, that it wanted to move towards NATO. I mean, it's a violation of something it has signed and is the legal successor state. And then we finally had the Budapest Memorandum of 1993, which said that, the United States, the UK, and Russia guarantee the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Now, of course, that was not a ratified agreement, but nonetheless, the other ones were, and have been ratified by by countries, and including Russia. So, what do we do when the fundamental basis of international behavior, international law has been violated, and then we say, oh, it doesn't matter, it doesn't count. If we stand by that and say, okay, well, this time it didn't matter, then where are we? What do we do? So in that case, in that regard, yes, I am. I think we should all be worried in that regard, because we've just basically thrown out the basis of peaceful interaction in Europe for the past, 50 years, 40 years. Now, I'm not, in terms of, Estonia as a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and a member of the European Union is a vastly different position than Ukraine, which is a member of neither. And I think that things such as Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty will hold, because as soon as it doesn't hold, then it ceases to exist as a treaty organization. So, NATO ends the minute it fails, because after that, no one any longer has any hope of collective security. So I'm not really that worried.
And you think the NATO response up till now has been adequate?
The NATO response, I would say, is, basically I would say that, I think the emphasis should always be on deterrence. A lot of the rhetoric has been about reassurance, which I think is more of a psychological concept. We're not in need of Freudian counseling. We don't have to be reassured. We want NATO to function on its deterrence basis, to say that, well, if you do this, you're going to have problems. Reassurance is probably the wrong term, because we're not nervous. We just would like to make sure that deterrence works.
Okay, well, thank you, President Ilves, very much.